This is the first lecture in our series. It is a general one, and in it I intend to discuss some of the reasons for studying funerary monuments and the information we can get from them, and perhaps some of the things one should look at when one goes and inspects monuments. It won't be technical. I'm not going to go into standing wall monuments or materials. Well, the first reason for studying monuments is their beauty. A few years ago, I happened to go into the Church of Douglas in Lanarkshire to really look at the medieval monuments to the Douglas family that are there, which are good for Scotland, and was amazed to find this superb piece. It's by J. Edgar Burham. It's to the Countess of Hume, who died in 1877, and it is almost unremarked. It doesn't feature in any of Historic Scotland's material on the chapel. It's misdescribed as by an Italian sculptor, although it's signed by Burham, and it is absolutely wonderful. It was so little known that it doesn't even appear in the definitive catalogue of Burham's work done in the 1970s. And this is, I think, one of the primary reasons for studying funerary monuments. In Britain, the bulk of all our sculpture until at least the beginning of the 18th century, and for some period after that, is preserved in churches. It's unappreciated, but many, many churches throughout the country have wonderful pieces of sculpture in them. And the next few slides just give you some examples. I've chosen them from small parish churches, not the great cathedrals, but these are, as you see from the labels, scattered over the country. And as you see, they are by a variety of artists from a variety of dates. Many of them are extremely moving. Many of them are quite funny. The one on the bottom right of your screen is a most moving monument to a lady from the Kamer family in West Chelborough in Dorset. It's of local workmanship. It's not high art, but it is nonetheless well worth visiting. And there are numerous pleasures to be got from the details of the monuments. There was someone working for the Baldwin workshop in Gloucestershire in the mid-17th century who loved doing the sort of zoological appendices of monuments, whether it's foot dogs or heraldic beasts. Here is a goat eating cabbages from Miserdon. Here from the same church is a howling griffin. You have to look at it in detail before you realize that the reason that the griffin is howling is that Sir William Sands has plonked his armored feet right on the griffin's wing. There's a super hedgehog, again, from almost certainly the same hand in Much Markle. These are other examples of sort of delightful carvings you get. A dragon and an absolutely superb wild man. Now, the ones, the few I've shown you so far, some of them we know who did them. The Baldwin carver, unless it was Baldwin himself, is anonymous. Others we are known to be by great sculptors, but those sculptors themselves are not sufficiently appreciated because their work is in churches. I mean, this is Maximilian Colt. John Bushnell, wonderful, wonderful sculptor, brilliant at conveying emotion. Here is a nice, elegant monument by Roubiliac, a lovely one by Flaxman, which Flaxman repeated this form in various forms, various different monuments. A nice monument from Hillingdon to a merchant. here is commerce admiring her, admiring the honest merchant sitting on his bales with his compass. Everyone, this is one of the few really well-known church monuments, chantries, absolutely brilliant sleeping children. The little girls died horribly in a fire. I think if this is a monument that brings consolation, which is clearly what it's supposed to do, it does do so. Chantry is, again, a wonderful sculptor. Here's one who is less well known, Mary Thornycroft, who's the mother of Hamo Thornycroft and various other artists, was one of Queen Victoria's favourite sculptors. Again, she's not well known, but this is a beautiful piece in Stamford-on-Avon. The damage on that monument is caused by bat excreta. It has apparently now been cleared up, but it is essential to get bats away from these masterpieces. And here is a monument in the same church to Lady Bray's son. It's actually by someone who's basically an interior designer, Felix Joubert. And it's an interesting monument because of when it was made and what it shows. As you see, it was made 20 years after the death. Edgell, the Lady Bray's son, who was called Edward Verney Edgell, was killed at the Battle of Ulundi in the Zulu War. It was the battle at which the Zulus were defeated. It was erected after the First Boer War, sorry. And it's an interesting piece because it was erected at a time when we were not, British, behaving at all well. There's nothing to be proud of in the way we conducted the Boer Wars. And yet it takes the trope of the loyal soldier honoring the deceased hero, and with the trophies of war in the forms of shield and assegais at his feet. It transforms him into an iconic figure of British imperial power, loved by his soldiers. And it's not just to the young man, Edward Verney Edgell. It is in many ways a monument to British imperial power. Now, obviously, aesthetic pleasure is the first thing one looks at looking at monuments, but one can also use them in all sorts of ways to back up, to enhance historical knowledge. One of the most obvious ways is that they are incomparable sources for costume history. Just look at this one. You can see the way the hose fit over the cannons of the trunk hose. You can recreate the shoes and look at the wonderful detail of the clocks on the stockings. This again is from the Baldwin workshop. Here are more examples of the way they can be used. They're much, much better than easel paintings because they're three-dimensional. Apparently, according to costume historians I've consulted, the way that Sir Edmund Barker has his periwig in bunches is unique. If it hadn't been for this monument, we wouldn't have known that was done. You can also see the hairstyles on these monuments, this monument from Hillingdon, and the back of the garments, the way that the tippet is fastened with a bow, the way her hair goes round at the back. So costume. We then move on to family history. And my particular interest is in emotional history, which is why I love the way we can learn about people from monuments. Here is Alice Cotton with her dead husband at Iworth in Bedfordshire. She holds a heart. They hold a heart between them, which they dedicate to God. He died prematurely. There is a most touching verse, delay not then till fate shall stop her breath to tell what day she died. His was her death. There's a long inscription below. If you look at the last 4 lines, they read that he left behind, he died in 1638, April. He left behind him a daughter aged 7 years and a half, and his wife a sorrowful widow, who with him hath entombed her heart. And then there's a bit scratched out. And what that reads is, as a pledge of her bodies after resting within this place, dedicating this small monument to his dear and loved memory, which in the meantime she sadly contemplates. Just over 2 years after Edmund Anderson's died, Alice Constable Anderson moved 15 miles up the road to Conington and married Sir Thomas Cotton, and so she's buried in Conington, not with her first husband, and there she is on a very fine monument in Conington. I think looking at these, there is a great debate about whether, at what point monuments can certainly be said to be portraits. These both come from the Marshall workshop. To me, they look as though they are absolutely the same woman, although they are by different Marshalls. Some people would say, well, that's what the Marshalls did. They did a fashionable woman of the age. This to me looks like a portrait, but we don't have a portrait of Alice Constable Anderson Cotton to check. And there is a question, I think, to what extent these monuments are portraits. The conventional view is that until certainly in the mid-17th century, they're really types rather than portraits. So Sir Humphrey Winch, who was a distinguished judge, that looks to me like a portrait. It might just be an idea of what a distinguished judge looks like. But when we can check, they are quite plausible. Sir John Pooley, and you can see that the monument is in fact, was in fact put up 40 years after his death. It is based on surviving portraits down to Sir John's frog earring. The Earl of Uxbridge in Hillingdon certainly is a portrait that looks just like other images we have of him. And the Cadge brothers at Loddon, clearly, again, based on a photograph. But, you know, this is capturing the essence of people. Now, the other aspect of history which we can get from monuments is how different people were, how different people's experience was. This is a very touching monument to Elizabeth Lady Crofts. You notice the little cherubs, and I think they really are cherubs, love gods rather than putty at the top. You notice that the cartouche, the achievement of arms, is in a heart. The bust of her wearing the pearl necklace is at the top of this monument. And there's a very affecting inscription which says that she died aged 46, having had 10 children, and that her husband intends no other monument for himself, but desires only to live in her memory, who was so much the worthier person. I think we'd all like our husbands to put that on our monuments. Yet hopes that God will so dispose of his death that as they lived 1 year together, as they lived 32 years together in all comfort and perfect love, so their bodies may lie and rest peaceably together. They were married for 32 years. She died at 46. She was married at 13 or 14 and then had 10 children. This, however affectionate the marriage, is a completely alien experience to us, I think. So we can use it for emotional and social history. we can also use monuments as material for all other aspects of history. I mean, I'm just going to show a few that bring out the contribution of immigrants to British society. Here is Jerome Bonali, an Italian, one of the large Italian community in London, buried at All Hallows Barking. Interestingly, he was a Catholic, but he is buried in a Protestant church. Or the form of his monument is with the prayer desk is Protestant rather than Catholic, but he's a rich merchant. So we've got this large immigrant communities right back to the 17th century. The one below to Alberto Gentili is to someone who was a religious exile. He was unorthodox and had to come to Britain as a refugee, where he became, for 22 years, Regius Professor of Law at Oxford. He had a large private practice in London, made an enormous contribution to British life. And you know, this is the brain drain, if you like. We were really fortunate to get this scholar. He made an immense contribution. The monument as it stands now was restored in 1877, but it's probably quite an accurate rendition of what it looked like. You've also had really serendipitous discoveries about immigrant families. I love the fact that at Ringsfield, Suffolk, Napoleon's great niece ended up as Lady of the Manor. She's Caroline Murat, the granddaughter of Jerome Murat. And she began her life in America, but ended up there. I just think that's great. The other monuments on this slide are things that are less, give us less cause for pleasure. Duleep Singh was the last Maharaja of Lahore. We stole his country, we stole the Kohinoor diamond, we forcibly made him, we forced him into exile here in Suffolk. His tomb is quite rightly a place of pilgrimage for Sikhs, and you can see the little lamp hung on it. All Duleep Singh's children made notable contributions to their forced country of adoption, but let's hear it for Prince Freddie, his son, who is buried at Blow Norton. Prince Freddie is a conservation champion. He was a member of the Royal Victorian Order. He had the Territorial Decoration. He was a fellow of the Society of Antiquaries of London. He did immense amounts of work for the Society for the Protection of Ancient Buildings in Norfolk. He saved the ancient house in Thetford and gave it to the town. He gave his collection of portraits of the exiled Stuarts, for whom he had a perfectly understandable sympathy, to the Inverness Museum. He kept a portrait of Oliver Cromwell upside down in his lavatory. He joined up in the First World War, even though he was over age, and served. He designed and paid for the war memorial at Blow Norton. We stole his country. We stole really his wealth, and he was jolly generous and a lot more than we deserve. Of course, immigrants aren't just one way, and we also force people into exile. Here is Adlar de Priest in Lutton in Northamptonshire. He comes from an extremely devout Catholic family. He had no chance of a career here, so he went and served essentially as, I think, a mercenary in the Catholic courts of Europe. He studied in Paris, he fought in Hungary, he served the courts of Bavaria and and in Italy, and returned home to die. What he's doing, he's got, this is a beautiful monument, again by Colt. He's bringing continental sophistication into a pretty remote bit of Northamptonshire. But this is also a message from the family to, if you like, certainly to the locals, but also to the country. If you, the monument says, Britain didn't, or England did not appreciate this man. You could have had his services, you chose not to. It's a sort of lament for lost potential. And funerary monuments quite often do have a local aspect. They may well be designed to reinforce the standing of the family. Blanche Parry was Elizabeth's closest companion. She may have been her closest friend. She was with her for her whole life. She went as a very young nurse. I mean, she came from a gentry family, but she went as a very young attendant to the infant princess and stayed with her until she died in 1590. And she has a beautiful monument in St. Margaret's, Westminster, which the Queen paid for. But her family also put one up to her in her hometown, home village in Buckland in Herefordshire. And what this does with its picture of Blanche and the Queen's mini lion dog sort of thing, is emphasizes that though the Parrys are a minorish gentry family in a pretty remote part of the country, they can pull strings in London. They have royal connections. This enhances their standing. And monuments also reflect intellectual movements. They reflect ideas going on at the time they're made. Here in Buckland, St. Mary in Somerset, in a church erected by Madeleine Aln's widower, who was the vicar, designed by Benjamin Ferry. The church itself is really worth a visit if you like Victorian architecture. The architecture of the church emphasizes Lance's Tractarian associations. You notice the wall tiles are clearly a reflection of decoration in Westminster Abbey. And the whole of the chancel, which centers on Madeleine Aln's grave on the north side, is a meditation on resurrection. There is the deposition in above the altar, and then Madeleine is arising from under a window that depicts the resurrection of Christ. So it is firmly in the Tractarian strand of English ecclesiology at that point. It's also in the tradition of romantic thought in Europe. Her monument is based on that to Maria Madeleine Aln's who died in childbirth in 1751 in Hindelbank in Switzerland. And the monument is a very close copy of it. Now that monument itself became a place of, became a sort of cult object for romantic thought at the period. It was visited by people like Goethe and people like Schopenhauer, and terracotta models of it were made. So this monument, which looks, I must admit, like something out of a Hammer horror movie, is actually placing the thought behind the church in the mainstream of European romantic thought, which is being combined with Tractarian ecclesiology. It's really quite interesting. It looks weird. It's in fact intellectually demanding. And here's another one which looks quite weird and is reflecting something that's going on back to again, these are all about emotional history. This is the monument to Sarah Latch at Churchill in Somerset, and on it, her husband reclines contemplating her shrouded body and parting the shroud from over her face to take a last kiss, last glimpse of her. He's pulling it back, I think, not shutting it. And the monument, the inscription starts, "Living and dead, thou seest how here we lie. I dote on death, preparing how to die." Now, this is one of a number of monuments from the mid-17th century that play with death as the death of the beloved, and also death as an orgasm, which was the slang of the period. It's like petit mort in French. In traditional physiology, the organs were the seat of the emotions. My heart broke. And very often expressions like this, my guts turn to water, they do reflect where one feels emotions. So there was a sort of integration in the way one looked at the body and the way one experienced the body that stopped once Vesalius and Keyes and other anatomists at Padua and other places started fossicking around with dead bodies. It's all very well to say the heart of this is the seat of the emotions, but at the time this monument was made, Harvey had just come along and said, it's a pump. And at this period, belief in the resurrection of the body is beginning to disappear. So you can't any longer contemplate a bodily reunion with your beloved. The emphasis becomes we shall all be changed. We die a physical body, we rise a spiritual body. And monuments like this, and poems like, for instance, Henry King's An Exequy, are wrestling with the fact that you love the body of the person as much as their personality. And even if you have a reunion after death, it's not going to be the same because that beloved body has gone. And I think that's why you also get the emphasis on the physical aspect of love in the pun on death as orgasm, as well as wanting to die, to be united with the person. So an interesting monument. Now, in the second part of this lecture, I'm just going to look at some of the things perhaps one might look at when one goes to visit churches and look at monuments. And I think the first thing one has to say is that between the Middle Ages and the Reformation, there was a huge change in what monuments were for. Before the Reformation, monuments united the dead with the living in a continuous act of prayer. The monument invites the Christian to pray for the soul of the deceased and thus shorten their time in purgatory, and in praying for the soul of the deceased, the Christian themselves shortens their own time in purgatory. Once the Reformation has destroyed purgatory, you cannot affect the fate of the dead. Eschatology is unalterable, if you like. So Monuments then become commemorative. Love was shown to the deceased, memory was continued to posterity, friends were comforted, and the reader put in mind of human frailty. They're there for comfort, they're there for commemoration, they may be there for an example to be emulated, but they are no longer linking you with the dead in the dynamic way that they did before the Reformation. So obviously the first thing you look at when you go and look at a monument is what date is it? And usually it's quite easy, but there is a strand of 17th century monumentalization, which makes one think that they really missed out in not having crosswords then. Here is a chronogram. A chronogram invites you to work out the date by adding up the Roman numerals incorporated in a fitting inscription. See here in Christ sleeps she, etc. You ignore the SFHT, but that adds up to 1634, which gives you the date of her death. And there are a lot of monuments at this period have frivolous aspects like that: chronograms, anagrams, acrostics. They're always worth looking out for. But when you've got the date of the monument, the date of the monument itself may tell you something. Here is, you will see that this one is put up 12 years after the death of Sir John Glanville by his grieving widow. Why didn't she put it up earlier? Because the Glanvilles were a loyalist family. They were a royalist family, and they had lost a great deal of money in the Civil War, and she probably couldn't have afforded to put it up until then. But there are other reasons for delayed monuments. Robert Bruce Cotton, the great book collector and antiquarian, traced his own line back to the princes of Scotland and consequently put up a series of monuments in his church of Cunnington. They're aniconic, but they celebrate his Scottish royal ancestry. Rather nice. Sometimes people took it to a greater extent than Cotton did. Cotton's monuments are aniconic. The point of monuments at North Ockenden in Essex, which this is a sort of ensemble where clearly the person who erects them is putting up the monuments to his ancestors that they would have put up to themselves had they known how distinguished their descendant was going to be. But you notice these monuments do make an effort at antiquarianism in the costume. They are wearing what the idea of appropriate costume for the date of all these ancestors were. And so they're antiquarian except in one aspect. They're based on the medieval formula of families kneeling on either side of an image. You can see that the image is, the religious image would have been in that space between the kneeling figures on the brass. But these ancestors, although they would have been Catholic, of course, are shown in a good Protestant format, kneeling on either side of a prayer desk. And sometimes people don't even bother to put up ancestors, they just steal them. This under glass is the very, very famous brass to Sir Roger de Trumpington, hijacked in the 17th and 18th century by the Pitcher family, who simply carved their inscriptions on either side of it, thus implying that Sir Roger is one of their ancestors. I don't care whose ancestors they were, they're mine now. You might also be interested in finding out who made the monument, and sometimes you're fortunate enough to find that they're signed. The one on the bottom left is the Böhm signature on the first monument I showed you. It is quite obscure, but there's no excuse for everyone having missed it for years. But there are other ways you can work out who made a monument. Sometimes you have to go to documentation. There's a surviving contract for this one. This one, the was always believed to be likely to be by Smithson, but the actual document that proved that it was by Smithson and that Smithson discussed it with Ben Jonson only turned up in 2009. There's other forms of documentation, artists, account books and catalogues. This is a monument by Nicholas Stone that is mentioned in the account book. And I think it's enough like that one that we can probably assume that that one's a stone as well. Then the other question we might ask is who the monument is to. Well, you know, Edmund Hammond, that's easy. It says who it is. It says he gave legacies of pious causes. In Exeter Cathedral, the monument to Sir Peter Carey, we could work out who this was, even if it didn't say it was to Sir Peter Carey, because his descent is traced in all those shields. We can use heraldry. If we read the language of heraldry, we can work out who the monument is to. And the lady from West Chelborough with the baby that I showed you at the beginning, sorry about that, I'll go back. We don't know exactly who she was, probably enough research hasn't been done yet. We do know she's a lady of the Keimer family because of the heraldry on the monument. Sometimes there are puns and people play with the names. This is to a little girl called Mary, and the decoration is marigolds. You see a marigold being plucked by death, a marigold being taken by a hand from heaven. This one is interesting. It may well be to an unbaptized infant, because the text only says it's an infant daughter. It says that her mother's name is Rose. And if you look at the decoration, the roses surrounding it, I think there is a very fair indication that this child was going to be called Rose, even though she may not have been named. Sometimes the people shown on, mostly people shown on monuments are the people commemorated. So here is Colonel Glanville at Broadhinton, and they're shown on those, even if they're wearing ridiculous Roman fancy dress, those are still the Earl and Countess of Rockingham. Sometimes there are interesting variations. You see, at Culford, Lady Bacon with children surrounding her and one in her lap. She's shown reunited with her, I think one of her own children, and then her grandchildren in heaven. So there she is in heaven, cuddling her grandchildren. I think it's a lovely monument. The monument by Richard Parker to Walter Devereux, you might expect it to be the family of the deceased, or in the position of or weepers on the sides of the tomb chest. But it seems to me that here what you're getting is a depiction of the news getting around the court. You know, look at the people's gestures. They are horrified at what they're just being told. So it's commemorating the sorrow and shock aroused by Devereux's death. Sometimes there are allegorical figures who may or may not be appropriate. The rather underclad lovelies on this one to Sir Thomas Bodley are the 7 liberal arts. Or it may just be the mourning populace. The Earl of Bridgewater was an agricultural reformer, and here are the agricultural workers and their dog all mourning him. This again is a monument, is a pattern that is used on other Westmacott monuments. Then one looks at who put the monument up. Usually it's put up by the heir. if it's put up by the widow and it says it's at her own expense, that is itself an act of devotion. So it's the last present, but you get variations. Here is one put up by a daughter to a mother, Lady Countess of Kent putting it up to her mother, who lived to a very great age. Here is heartbreakingly a monument made by the artist to his son, Ambrose George, whose names are indicated by the patron saints above. He was the only son. I mean, this one is just awful. So sad. Sometimes it's by a friend or a grateful pupil. Here is Thomas Brand in Yorkshire. Thomas Brand made his living as a young clergyman. He made his living taking young men on the grand tour, and one of them put up this monument. I think it's by the Earl of Aylesbury, but I'm not actually quite sure about that. And then finally, one gets into the world of dysfunctional families, real spite. I've been looking at good emotions. Let's finish by looking at a few bad ones. Here is Richard Hill, whose sister was so horrified by his widow's failure to put up a monument, even though he left his widow more than her original fortune, besides a fair joint to her, but she remarried within a year of his death. So his only sister, Mrs. Frances Hill, thinking her brother's affection too much neglected, erected this small monument. And Frances Hill was a person of very definite feelings. There she is on her war monument, where the Latin inscription is exactly the same as is in English on her own ledger slab. She served God in pure virginity and abstinence from wine and strong drink without a vow. The number of her years had taken very little from the comeliness of her person, less from the vivacity of her parts, nothing from the goodness of her character. I think she must have been unbearable, but there she is. And here is, never neglect the ledgers. Here is Bridget Nelson, who after bearing the fatigues of a married life, borne by her with incredible patience for 4 years and 3/4, baiting 3 weeks, and after the enjoyment of the glorious freedom of an early and unblemished widowhood, resolved to run the risk of a second marriage bed. Now that is actually quite a well-known one. What isn't so well known is the one on its right, which is to her deceased husband, and explains the trials that she had to put up with, because he left no will and she had to have a long chancery suit with her brother-in-law in order to get possession of her own property again. So the satisfaction of knowing people behaved badly in the past is, I think, not to be underestimated. And you never know what you're going to find on monuments. There is someone's favorite recipe. Right.